Hi everyone, and welcome to the Fake Love and Flying Monkeys podcast. My name's Nova Gibson and I am your host. My area of expertise is in supporting victims and survivors of narcissistic abuse and other toxic relationships. I'm the principal counsellor at Brighter Outlook Narcissistic Abuse Counselling Service, and I'm also the author of Fake Love, Understanding and Healing from Narcissistic Abuse. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about everything from the initial pink cloud you find yourself on at the start through to the horrific discard and the powerful trauma bond that keeps you hooked. So take your imaginary seat on the roller coaster that is narcissistic abuse, and don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode of Fake Love and Flying Monkeys. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fake Love and Flying Monkeys. Today I am lucky enough to have a police officer, or actually a detective, who is from the United States, and his name is Brandon Wootan. Now, Brandon has kindly offered to talk with us here today. He's a police detective with a municipal police department in northern Colorado. He's currently assigned to the Crimes Against Persons Unit. Detective Wootan also created and co-leads, this is what I love about Brandon, he co-leads a domestic violence high-risk team that focuses on preventing DV homicide. Detective Wootan has been a sworn police officer since 2013, working in the state of Montana until January 2022. He's also served as an adjunct instructor at the Montana Law Enforcement Academy in the areas of domestic violence, stalking, strangulation. That there's so much more I could tell you about Brandon, but I really want to introduce you to him. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Yeah, no, but thank you for having me. It's a honor to be here. I never thought that I would be speaking to folks in Australia, so thanks for having me.
Look, my absolute pleasure. And I haven't been able to speak to any detectives and police officers in Australia who specifically, support and educate and work with domestic violence victims. So when I saw you on LinkedIn, Brendan, I was just like really excited because there is this absolute interconnectedness between police and domestic violence victims, in that you're the first point of call. You're where they go. So it's so important to know that there's people like you in the police force who are really aware of what they're going through and are advocating for them. So, Brendan, tell us about your role and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I'm a detective. I specialize in domestic violence. Obviously, lots of things come with that, right? There's many crimes that are attached to domestic violence. Everything from phone harassment all the way to sexual assault, and unfortunately, sometimes homicide. So my role, my existence, is essentially to help prevent the ultimate bad thing, which is the homicide. All the while understanding that if we're going to prevent the homicide, we have to start small, right? We have to intervene at the misdemeanor level. We have to intervene when it is coercive control before it gets to something ultimately more fatal. So really professionally, that's what I do. That's what I get up for every day. Is to serve survivors of domestic violence, and in whatever that looks like for them, in whatever stage of the process they are in.
Yeah. Is there a reason that this is so important to you? Like, where do you get your passion from?
Yeah, absolutely. So I come by it honestly. My first 8 years of life were pretty tumultuous. I grew up in a home in which domestic violence was very prevalent. I unfortunately witnessed my mother be the victim of domestic violence on multiple occasions via multiple different men, and just the byproduct of all that, right? Substance abuse and financial struggles and, being the main caretaker for my little sister when I was, 5, 6, 7 years old, really sort of ingrained in me a passion, albeit I didn't know that it would lead me here. In my, young life after the age of 8, it was miraculous. The people that ended up raising me, gave me everything that I could ever hope for. And so it went from one extreme to the other. And I never really knew that I wanted to be in law enforcement even. But when I ultimately found myself here and I started responding to domestic violence calls, it was almost like, and I know I'm speaking to a mental health professional, as someone who isn't a mental health professional, I now realize what was happening, which is that I was kind of reliving all the things that I went through as a kid. And I see in me, or in the kids in these calls, I would see me. And so that really just drove me to, every time I thought of, the things that I went through, my ability to potentially save one more kid or one more survivor of domestic violence from the situation that I went through, really that's my driving force.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So you're like the perfect person to be educating not just the public but other police officers, because you've been there. You were the kid who was watching mum and dad, whatever happened for you. You were the child who was parentified because of what was going on for you, and you're now seeing this, and you can above anyone have empathy for the victim and know exactly what's going on. So, Brendan, let's talk about coercive control, because you mentioned that, and coercive control has now become, there's legislation in Australia. It was brought in about July, I believe, in Queensland, and last year in New South Wales. It's only just become, I believe, a criminal offence now in New South Wales, and not till next year in Queensland. Now, coercive control, as you know, goes hand in hand with any domestic violence. There is always that control. So how do the police judge or support a victim, or know that they are a victim, if there's no bruises? And sometimes they don't even know they're a victim because they've normalized it.
Sure. So, I would start by saying that in the vast majority of domestic violence investigations, there are not physical injuries. In fact, when we go on domestic violence calls and there is physical injury, that is more rare than the opposite. And so I think that's a huge misnomer, not only, societally, but potentially even in or with victims, right? And so I think we start is that first understanding that the absence of physical injury is common, particularly in strangulation cases, right? Upwards of 80% of reported strangulations have no visible injury. And so I think that's where we start, right, is understanding that the lack of physical injury is not inherently a problem.
Yeah.
The next place we go and how we identify coercive control, and I have to say, I have to stop and say, amazing on Australia for criminalizing coercive control. I think, in our conversations in the past, there's been like, oh man, I wish we did some stuff better. But what I can tell you is that I can't think of one place in the United States that criminalized coercive control. And so I want to say, good job to the government of Australia.
The lead up to that, I don't know if you're aware of Hannah's Law, it's called, and beautiful Hannah and her 3 children were murdered by her abusive ex, and it only came out later that there was just prolific or horrendous coercive control, and her parents have fought so hard to get that law in place, and it's called Hannah's Law, and it's definitely a start criminalizing it. But we also need what you're doing, Brandon, which is to educate those who are going to be responsible for enforcing the law around what coercive control is.
Right. Well, and I think how, to your question earlier, is, how do we identify it, and how do we even name it for the survivor?
Yeah.
Is really comes down to two things. One is a basic understanding of the cycles of domestic violence, right? Coercive control. I mean, I know that that's kind of I don't want to say a buzzword, but a newer term. Well, the Duluth model for Minnesota in the United States, power and control, right, has been the concept for decades. So it's not like this is new information to us.
Yeah.
I think what it comes down to is understanding, and then secondarily, how do we conduct our interviews, right? How do we speak to survivors, and do we take our time? I think that's something that, it doesn't matter who I talk to. If I could talk to any police officer as it relates to domestic violence, I would say take your time, right? Because there's certain things that a survivor is going to say that on its face, right, doesn't individually, equate to a crime. But if we're talking about things like, hey, every morning when I get up to leave for work, my keys are in a different spot, and I spend 10 minutes trying to find my keys, and that makes me late for work. And the ramifications of that are that my boss gets mad at me. And the ramifications of that is that I get a poor performance evaluation. And the ramification of that is that I don't get a bonus. Well, what happens when you don't get a bonus, right? Now your abusive partner can use that against you and make you feel as though you're the problem. And it all started with moving keys.
That's
right.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Brandon, because there's this misnomer out there that coercive control is stopping you from having money, stopping you from going anywhere, stopping you from having social media, which it is. But it's the insidious tactics like that have a flow-on effect, like exactly that example. And that is what I'm so glad that you're aware of. Just a perfect example.
Well, and hopefully when an officer hears that, right, if they respond to an intimate partner violence call, or someone comes to the police station, or whatever the case is, and the survivor says, this specific thing is happening, right, my keys are getting moved, I think we're pretty quick to move on from that topic, right? Because, again, in and of itself, that's not a huge deal. I misplace my keys every day. And it's not because my wife is moving them. It's because I forget them. And so I think if we don't ask the question, right, tell me more about that. Tell me more about the keys. Because it really is not about the keys. And if you ask them to tell you more about the keys, that's when you'll find out what it's really about.
That's right. And the victim's been taught or conditioned to believe, because the keys keep moving, just like the movie Gaslighting, where the lights kept dimming, they've been conditioned to believe they're crazy. And this is insidious. It's not a light going on and off. It's a slow drip feed. So, yeah, it's so important with coercive control to look at the build-up to what was going on, and also to educate the victim around what is coercive control.
Right.
You're not crazy. Yeah.
And if I could add one thing to that, it would be, what we're responding for, especially as a patrol officer, to a domestic violence call, we're responding for what happened that day. I think where we miss the mark as a profession is, let's start 10 years ago, right? Let's start 10 years ago and tell me how it started, right? I want the survivor to tell me it started great, right? Because it did. If it didn't, they wouldn't still be where they are.
That's
and
right.
So I think if we help them paint the picture, it also helps the officer make a decision. It helps the prosecutor prosecute the case. And if nothing else, it names it for the survivor that, hey, this is the cycle. And now I see the cycle, and I'm not in it because I want to be. I'm in it because this is how it works, right? This is brain chemicals. There's so much more to this than just
the trauma bond. Yeah, absolutely. So, Brandon, earlier we were talking before the audio started recording about a model that you want to see rolling out in the US that has just, I believe, begun in Australia, where in Cairns there's now a mental health professional who, and this is a trial until 2026, I believe, and only in Cairns, a mental health professional will go out with each police officer for that initial contact with the domestic violence victim. Well, the fact that you're trying to roll out this model is an indication of just how important it is. And to be honest, I don't see why they're trialing it. It should just be a given that police, as passionate as they are like you're not a mental health professional, and to have your skills combined with a mental health professional to attend at first point of call to these victims and to help the police distinguish victim to abuser, I think it needs to happen right now. I don't know why it's just a trial and we've got to wait till 2026. But tell me about your model.
Yeah, so my thought would be, I'll start by saying that, anything that is co-response is something that is beneficial, right?
Yeah.
And we've seen it in other areas of law enforcement, right? For how many years have we had officers that are specifically trained in detection and, arrest of impaired drivers, right? That's been decades. Okay, well, the response to that was because there were people dying as a result of impaired driving, okay? We also have people who specialize in response to mental health. So we have police officers paired with mental health clinicians who go to people experiencing mental health crisis. That should be the case, right? We're pairing an officer whose temperament, whose training, whose passion is geared towards mental health. They're paired with a mental health professional, and we get better outcomes as a result.
Yeah.
What has sort of blown me away is that, right, domestic violence is a tale as old as time. If you go back hundreds, thousands of years, domestic violence is the most commonly perpetrated crime in society.
It's an epidemic.
So then, why shouldn't we pair a police officer who's passionate, who's has all the most up-to-date training, who really wants to be on those calls, with someone, an advocate, right, a community-based advocate who can provide on-site help, just like you're talking about that project in Australia.
Yeah.
And so I can't take credit for the idea of a co-response, but what I can say is that we're significantly behind the times as it relates to co-response in domestic violence. We have specialties in law enforcement for everything. Why do we not have one for domestic violence?
I know. That's crazy. I don't know what the stats are in the US, but at the moment, I believe one woman is dying every 4 days. It is an absolute epidemic. There's a group called What Were You Wearing? What Were You Wearing? Who had rallies all over Australia where thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people are attending because they've had enough and not enough is being done. So, yeah, it's crazy, isn't it, that all of those other situations are getting those joined forces and not domestic violence. It just doesn't make sense. Okay, so Brandon, the system unfortunately hasn't done a great job in the past, okay, and this is what you're trying to change, but the reality is it hasn't done a great job in the past of protecting women. So there's a lot of distrust out there that they will come forward, and we know that victims don't come forward. Very rarely will they come forward on the first time. It'll more likely be the 10, 20, 30 at the time. So it takes a lot of courage for them to actually come forward. And in the past, they haven't felt like they were heard or even believed. And even if they were believed, there wasn't enough evidence. So they've had to go home to their abuser after finally having the courage to report, and that stopped them from ever reporting again because of the punishment. And if, on top of that, if the abuser did get some kind of punishment, it was virtually a slap on the wrist. And if they did get a DVO, a restraining order, they just breach it again and again and again. And then they get a slap on the wrist, a slap on the wrist, a slap on the wrist. So how do we regain this, the trust from victims with all of this historical discrimination and lack of support?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, if there was a person who could answer that perfectly and solve all the problems, they'd be a lot richer than you and I.
Yeah.
But really, it comes down to two things. One is the beginning is a trauma-informed response from law enforcement.
Yeah.
And again, that comes back to understanding, right? It's unfortunate to me. There are still police officers who ask themselves the question, why doesn't she just leave? And every time I hear that, that makes my blood boil.
Yeah, me too.
Because I think back to my mother, right? Why didn't she just leave? Well, there were a multitude of reasons she didn't leave.
Yeah.
She had 2 kids. She wasn't stable financially. There were so many things that prevented her from doing those things. And that doesn't make her a bad person.
Yeah.
That just means that she was limited by the situation she was in.
And post-separation abuse. That
Right.
that's a thing. That's when women leave. That's when they lose their lives.
Well, and statistically, that's the most common time for domestic violence homicide to occur. And so what the second part is, right, we need a trauma-informed response by police, but we also need a multidisciplinary team of professionals on the other end of these cases to provide quick, comprehensive, and trauma-informed support to the survivor.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the mission of the high-risk team that I lead here is our team is not a prosecution team, right? We don't exist to get convictions. We exist to do what's good for the survivor. And sometimes moving forward with a criminal case is not the answer. And that's why we have the team of professionals that we do, right? We have advocates at the table. We have prosecutors. We have pretrial folks. We have, just this vast array of people. And they all have different experiences and different expertise. And so when a high-risk case comes to the team the day after an event happens, and that's the key, right, is we're getting quick intervention. We can then wrap the survivor in support. And so where I think the system has failed historically is that police officers make an arrest, they take the person to jail, there's no lethality assessment, there's no any of that stuff done either by law enforcement or by the court, and then they follow a bond schedule and they give them a bond and they get out the next day. And yeah, you might have a systems-based advocate call you and say, hey, this is the next court date. But are we really closing loops for survivors? Are we really making it so there is a one-stop shop for them to get all the answers they need?
Exactly.
And I think that's where we change the perception, and that's where we right the wrongs that as a society, and I guess I'll say as a world, right? Because I'm talking to you in Australia.
Yeah,
where we as a world have done survivors wrong is by working individually and not working together. And so I think where we build back a lot of that trust is also that there's one voice to the survivor, right? It's not the law enforcement officer saying, hey, this is going to happen, but then the prosecutor not talking to the officer and then saying, no, this is going to happen. And then a community-based advocate saying, well, what you should expect to happen. And then all three of those things are different. The premise behind the disciplinary team is that there's one voice, right? There is one common message given to the survivor. And if we expect to keep them safe, and that is, of course, our goal, then we must be unified. And so I think to answer your question, that's how we fix what we've done wrong in the past.
Yeah. With that one-stop shop, which I love that, that should be the name of your project, one-stop shop for domestic violence victims, because it really needs to be, because if there's any loophole, a victim is going to go back because they're trauma bonded to their abuser. They're going to go back. And I think one really important thing that doesn't kind of get brought up enough, I don't believe, is that victims, when they're fleeing their abuser, they're going to have their kids. They're going to have their children. So when they're writing their report or, talking about their report, they need to know that their children are going to be looked after and that they can really concentrate on what they're doing. I think that is one thing that definitely needs to be factored in there. What do you think about that, Brendan? Is that something that's being discussed?
I completely agree. And to address that, we have, I don't know what they call it in Australia, but in the United States, we call them child forensic interviewers. So they're people who are experts in simply interviewing children.
Oh, yeah.
They're not law enforcement. They don't work for us. But they sit on our high-risk team because they're the experts as it relates to kids. And so if it's talking about timing of, this child witnessed domestic violence, Does it make sense to interview them now, or does it make sense to wait so that the mom has time to do whatever it is that she needs to do?
Yeah.
And so they're experts on children, and they can help inform the high-risk team on what to do next. They can also help the survivor, right? Because one of the biggest issues for them is, well, how do I resource my kids appropriately? Well, if we have the Child Advocacy Center on the team, which we do, that we've immediately got that resource for the survivor and their kids. And so that person trying to flee can worry less about what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
And so,
absolutely.
Yes, to your point, that's a critical part of the team.
Yeah, perfect. And then that someone will look after their children, and while they're doing their interview is going to take a lot of stress from that victim. And this is just such an amazing holistic approach. So Brandon, what are your thoughts on the connectedness between you and legislation, in that in so many words, you catch them, you get them, you give the restraining order, you do your job, and then they get let out, and potentially they go back. What's that like for you when you feel like you're powerless to see what justice in your eyes?
Well, so I think that's something too that's evolved as I've evolved as a police officer. It used to be infuriating, right? You do this, you build a good case, you take the person that you believe committed this crime to jail, and then the system says, nope, you're out the next day.
Yeah.
Where I've transitioned my thought process is not so much, is it personally impacting me, but what does it do to the survivor, right? If we make an arrest today and they know that their abusive partner's out tomorrow, have we helped that survivor in that scenario? And I would argue a lot of times the answer is no. And so my thought on it now is, let's not do what is good for law enforcement. Again, we're a multidisciplinary team.
Yeah.
So and I can't take credit for the model, right? The Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center. I mean, there's people who created the model. I just operate underneath it. But again, that's where the model comes into play, right? It's not about us. It's not about the prosecutor. It's about the survivor. And so if we can focus on what is best for them and what's going to keep them safe, then the system's going to do what it's going to do, Nova. I can only put my best foot forward.
Exactly.
But as long as we're advocating for what's best for the survivor, then I feel like we've done our job.
Perfect. So what you're saying is, okay, it's out of our control. If the legislation is not going to put deterrents in place, as in jail time, first offence, jail. If they're not going to do that, then we're powerless. We can't do anything, but we're going to take the victim and we're going to protect them.
Right. It's all about safety planning. It's all about action planning. It's all about action planning, too, for accountability for the offender. Right. So part of the high risk model, or any multidisciplinary model to impact, intimate partner violence, is using evidence-based lethality assessment. And so, officers on scene administering these assessments, and I don't know if they're used in Australia. There's several different ones used here. But at the end of the day, if we're assessing for lethality risk, that feeds the high-risk team. Basically, it tells us the roadmap for where to go next, obviously in conjunction with the survivor. And so irrespective of what the courts do, irrespective of what any part of the system does, we can work together to at least safety plan. We can work together to at least action plan and make plans for offender accountability down the road.
Yeah. So are you, and I'm sure you are, but tell us about how you address with victims the fact that they go back. And we just assume because of that very powerful trauma and so many other reasons, they go back. The abuse has died down, and they're craving that roller coaster again. And often they retract their statement and they go back and they go back. How does the model work with the victim in convincing them not to go back?
Well, I would say, so that was a two-part question. I'll answer the first one first. So
it was. Sorry.
When I talk to survivors of domestic violence and I talk about why they go back, I I think it's probative, right? I don't think it's a bad thing, because if they talk to me about why they go back, and I can say, hey, tell me more about, this specific thing, and they explain to me, well, it's because I go back because I don't have any financial security, or I go back because of trauma bond, or I go back because if I do this, my chances that he's going to stalk me or do any of these things goes up. If we don't ask the question why, we just make assumptions, and that's the last thing the system should ever do, is assume why a survivor goes back. More often than not, there's very good reasons that they do, and part of that is self-preservation on their part, and the other part is a distrust of the system, that the system's going to have their back. And so if we don't ask the question, we're blinding ourselves as to the reality. So actually, I like to not confront that, but actually like tease it out. Because if we want to, if we're going to move forward with a case, and we're down the road going to get a domestic violence expert to testify to why this person did what they did, well, an expert can testify to the cycles and the recantations and all those things, and actually, that's normal, and that's okay.
I think that's so important to do that, Brandon, to ask them. I think it's important to confront them, because the victim often doesn't understand, well, most of the time, they don't understand themselves. They just know that they're going to explode unless they go back because of that powerful trauma bond and all those other reasons. So they feel crazy. They've been conditioned to believe they're crazy. So if you as a police officer can go through all of those reasons with them and, make them feel not crazy and look at the reasons and I guess talk to them about them being, really valid reasons, although irrational because they're going back to the abuse. But in their mind, they're valid fears. Their perceptions and fears are real. I think it's so important to confront it.
Well, if we don't ask those questions, then what we're allowing is the system to make up the answer for them.
Yeah.
We're allowing a jury to speculate, well, I would never have done that. It doesn't make sense to go back. I wouldn't have done that. But if you can actually show...
There's got to be something wrong with the victim, because who would go back to that? I wouldn't go back. How often do we hear it?
Too often. And you know what? We have the unique ability as a first responder, as an initial investigator to domestic violence, to lay the foundation for that well ahead of it, right? And if the answer is I go back because I want to, sometimes you get that. But more often than not, if you just ask good questions, you'll get a response. It's all about communication.
Yeah.
And then the second part of your question was, how does the high-risk model, how does this multidisciplinary team address the recantation and address the going back?
Yeah.
Two parts. One is education, right? We have the advocates. We have the DV service providers on the team. So we have that wraparound support at the beginning. We also approach it from a standpoint of, hey, we expect the recantation. It is not a problem when that happens, right? Because again, that's the bigger picture of the cycle of domestic violence. And if we can ride that wave with the survivor, if we can stay with them, then they're far more likely to continue through the process if that's what's best for them. And so if we stay engaged from the beginning, we understand the cycles, and we also understand that recantation doesn't mean that they're lying. It doesn't mean that this prosecution can't go forward. There's legal avenues to address that.
Yeah.
We just have to understand, work together, and keep the survivor as educated as we can.
Yeah. Yeah, it's normal for them to, in the heat of the moment or the heat of the abuse, to go and make the statement, and then when the abuser, love bombs them again or hoovers them, throws them some breadcrumbs, and that moment's gone, and they're scared, they'll lose their job. They've been conditioned to feel like they're responsible for their abuse, and if they get a restraining order, then oh my goodness, their abuser might lose their job, or their name might be mud, and the victim feels responsible for that. So all these things, they go and they retract, and yeah, I love that you're on top of that, and you're saying that it is normal, because that's what victims do. They're intimidated, and so many other reasons they retract their statement. Yeah.
Well, and I want to say even further that more often than not, they're correct, right? Like, if we want to talk about lethality factors and things of that, like, let's talk about a loss of sense of self for their abusive partner. If their abusive partner loses their job, not only can they not provide for the children or the victim, but they may lose their sense of self. And when someone loses their sense of self, lethality risk goes up significantly. Now you pair that with a history of strangulation, you pair that with a history of firearm ownership, and now we're at an incredibly lethal boiling point. And that's before the survivors ever even decided to make the decision to leave. And so if as a system we don't start to recognize that we aren't always the answer, we're never going to move the needle on intimate partner homicide, because we have to understand that we aren't always the answer, and that the holistic approach just has to be the way.
Yeah. Brandon, a number of my lovely clients in Australia are Indigenous Australians, and also men and women, people from all genders, people from in the gay community, LGBTQIA plus community, and they have I guess, like women, a real lack of trust in the system because of historical stuff. I don't know what it's like in the US, but in Australia, there is an overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in the prison system, and an overrepresentation in the child protection system. And they have very little trust for the police because of, historical discrimination. How do we work together with them to build that trust up again, so they feel they will be protected and supported?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that is not unique to Australia. We face the same issues, albeit with different populations. Yeah. We face the same issues. And so, again, I'm going to go back to the multidisciplinary model. On our team here, and I think any team anywhere, right, you need to start by assessing your community. Who's in your community? What is the makeup of your community, right? So in Northern Colorado, there is a fairly high Hispanic population. Well, if our multidisciplinary team doesn't have representation from the Latinx community, what are we doing, right? So we have a center that's here in Northern Colorado that is a resource center specific for the Latinx community. And there's representation from that resource center on our high-risk team. That's critically important, because if we're dealing with a survivor of domestic violence that's from the Latinx community, we need to be not only trauma-informed, but we need to be culturally competent, right? If we go into those situations and we don't understand their culture at a minimum, again, what are we doing? How is the system doing anything to help them? And so, in Australia's case, right, if you're going to have a multidisciplinary team like this, you've got to include, right, Aboriginal representation. You've got to include folks from these marginalized communities, from the LGBTQIA plus. Yeah, it's got to be there. And if it's not there, we're failing them. And for me it would be insane for me to say, despite how passionate I am, despite how much I understand domestic violence, if I don't tap other experts in culture, in things like this, again, I'm not going to succeed. And so how we address it and how we build it back is simply by being empathetic and communicating. And I know that's potentially an oversimplification, but I really don't think it's that difficult.
Yeah. Oh, look, perception is reality. And this is their perception. Their reality is that they don't trust the police. So I think, we need to talk to them. But what do you want us to do? How can we open up the lines of communication with you? How can we, build your trust? I think, as you said, ask them, talk to them. And I don't know that that's happening. I think that there's a lot of assumptions being made around what they need instead of asking them what they need.
Correct. And I think, too, another piece of it is taking ownership of the failures. I think unless we start by recognizing that their distrust in the system is well placed, then again, we're never going to bridge that gap. And so, when I've met historically with victims of domestic violence in these marginalized communities, And their response to me at the beginning is gruff, right? And they're like, you're not here to help me. You're a white male.
Yeah.
How do you know what's going on with me? And I start by saying, you're right, I don't. I have no clue. I can't imagine what it's like to be in your shoes. Help me understand. And so unless we start there, all the rest of this is sort of semantics.
Yeah. You've got to see it through their eyes, don't you? We can't just assume that we know, what they need. That distrust or lack of trust is there for a reason, isn't it? We've spoken about like the minority groups who have, a lack of trust, understandably, with the police. But what about the idea of who a domestic violence victim is? Is that something that is part of your training, your future training? Because there's this misconception, and I've seen it on a lot of court TV in the US, where I've seen some outcomes that I've gone, what? There's this misconception that all victims look and sound the same. They should, all be, I don't know, crying and battered and bruised. And if you come forward and you're wearing a suit, for instance, you can't possibly be a victim. And victims don't all fit into one box. That's why there can't be this one size fits all approach, because victims are come in all shapes and sizes. So is that something that is part of your the model?
Yeah, well, so training is obviously a key component of our model, because if we're not training, if we're not pushing back the the collective knowledge in the room, again, we're missing the mark on impacting intimate partner violence. And so, yes, that is certainly part of the model. What I will say, and I can only speak, I guess, for the agencies in Northern Colorado, I can say they're doing a really good job of training their officers on trauma and understanding that trauma doesn't look the same in everybody, right? Everybody has a different response, right? The survivor that shows up in a suit, I interpret that. Well, number one, I don't interpret that because that's not my job. But secondarily, if they were to tell me, I might even ask, tell me more about the suit. Well, I would venture to say the response you're going to get is, look, I've been stripped of all the power by my abusive partner. This is one way that I can take some of it back, right? I can show up here as a professional and speak to you. And so if we're going to first of all, if we're going to expect people to be in a box, we're wrong. But secondarily, there's nothing wrong with asking the question, right? Naming emotion is never a bad thing when you're doing an investigative interview as a police officer, right? If I have a victim who's stoic and just won't even, bat an eye, tell me more about how you feel right now. And I can guarantee you're going to get something more than what you're seeing physically. And so I think if we just really, again, I'm going to go back to what we talked about early on, take our time, ask good questions. And none of these questions, I want to be clear now, but none of these questions are to cast any sort of doubt or blame on the survivor. It's allowing the survivor to speak, right? Because for so long, they've been told either that they can't, or what they say is irrelevant, or any of those things. I want you to tell me about you. I don't want to assume anything. And so I actually think we miss those opportunities and should take them more.
Absolutely. A victim has been told they're crazy. That's a given. And the abuse with coercive control, narcissistic abuse, they're made to believe the abuse is all their fault, and they deserved the abuse. So for you as a detective, a police officer, to sit down with them and actually give them time and space and empathy, and not look at them with a look like they are crazy, that is going to mean the world to a victim. What about reactive abuse, Brandon? There was a worldwide case. Globally, it was known. It was certainly well known and documented here in Australia around Gabby Petito, and the fact that her abuser was seen to be by the police as, this calm and cool, collected person, and she the crazy one, and she was crying, and they basically just said, split up. Now we know what happened, and the coercive control and the physical abuse and reactive abuse, where the victim is baited into retaliating or protecting themselves, defending themselves, or just out of frustration. The abuser will poke until the the victim finally erupts, and then they engage in what we call DAVO, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, and the true victim becomes labelled as the abuser. Is this something that you think has been a failure in certain cases that is in the past and is going to be addressed in this model where, you'll be able to tell victim from offender, and they don't always look like you think they're going to look?
No, and yes, I mean, our model does address that. And one of the things that I would say to that is most places, almost all places in the United States, have what's called predominant aggressor laws. And so in essence, the law spells out for the police officers, hey, all the while these two parties might be injured or this one party might be injured, the law affords you the ability to look with hindsight and get a bigger picture of the totality of the relationship. Earlier in our conversation, I talked about, officers shouldn't limit their investigation to what happened today. They should start 10 years ago. And so had they done that with Gavin and Tito, maybe we get to a different result with that investigation. Yeah. And so secondarily, I want to say, having been a uniformed police officer responding to domestic violence calls at 2 a.m, stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? There are things that, imperfections in the system, mandatory arrest laws that dictate we arrest, a person, even though we might know that in the big picture, they are the victim of the totality. Well, again, how do we address that stuff if we don't have a multidisciplinary team for the officer to go to and say, hey, I made this arrest because the law said I had to.
Exactly.
But I don't think that this person that I arrested is truly the predominant aggressor in this relationship.
Yeah.
Hey, high-risk team, take a look at it.
Exactly.
Right now, we with the ability of time, right, can go through the histories and say, oh, well, this guy has a criminal history 2 states away in which he's been arrested 3 other times for domestic violence. Meanwhile, the person we arrested doesn't have a criminal history. And so as a team, we can come together and say, hey, what's the best outcome for this case? And again, as the law enforcement officer, it's not my job to get charges dismissed. In fact, we did exactly what we had to do. But does the high-risk team come together and say, hey, what's the best outcome for both the victim and the suspect in this case? And how do we, again, prevent a DV homicide? No matter who's going to commit it, we just need to prevent it.
It's so important to look at the lead up, Brendan, in domestic violence. Like you said, nothing happens in a vacuum. And, the abuser, that the narcissist is so manipulative. And I hear every day just about of instances where they'll set up, manufacture a situation to, like, even say to the victim, come on, hit me. Come on, hit me. You want to. And then they'll, fall back heavily on a wall and have this tiny little bruise. And then the victim thinks, I am responsible for that. The abuser calls the police. Unless you have that holistic approach, why would the police who sees someone with an injury, someone who seems to be erratic, why would they not assume that person was the abuser? Too often the actual victim gets a restraining order against them. And even if a lot of the time they get a restraining order against the abuser, this is a topic for another discussion, Brendan. The abuser habitually goes and gets a cross DVO to make them retract it. They will manufacture these situations. So the police can only go with the legislation, as you said, and what they're seeing. So that's why it's so important, your work in looking at the lead up to it.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think investigating anything that's important, but particularly in domestic violence, because we didn't get here today, right? We've been here for months. And if we don't understand the totality, then, we're unfortunately doing our jobs not to the best of our ability.
Yeah. Look, Brandon, I absolutely love this model, and there may be something similar rolling out in Australia that I'm just not aware of, but I haven't heard anything if there is. But I absolutely love this holistic approach. I imagine there would be something out there, but where to now? Like, we talk about education and awareness. Now, education and awareness clearly for the people like yourself, police officers, first responders, the public in general. But where does it start? I'm a big believer, and I wanted to know your thoughts on education beginning like in school, like, kids being taught what coercive control is, what love bombing looks like, because as you said earlier, no relationship starts off abusive. If it would be easy to leave if they were abusive 100% of the time. No abuser is abusive 100% of the time. So what do you think? And is anything like that happening in the States where, we need to get at when they're young, for perpetrators and victims?
Right. No, I think there's a huge, a huge need for that. I can speak as a former school resource officer. I would teach classes to the high school kids on what a healthy relationship looks like, because we do know that the most victimized population is the ages between 18 to 25 as it relates to domestic violence, at least in the United States. Yeah. And so if we're not getting to our high school, college age kids, we're going to miss an entire cycle of generational violence. And so, and we don't, I would say we don't need to, I don't think we need to go down the rabbit hole too much, but I think helping kids understand what's healthy, right? This is normal in a relationship, right? Because a lot of relationships have markers that are the same as a narcissistic DV relationship, right? There's gift giving in normal relationships, just like there is in narcissistic relationships that turn abusive. And so helping kids, young kids, differentiate between what's normal and what isn't, and then saying, hey, if this is what you start to see, maybe you tell a trusted adult, maybe you tell a trusted friend, and so that we can start trying to impact and break these cycles.
Yeah, and educating them around, what is normal, because often, as what happened with you, Brandon, they will be developing their own coping mechanisms to survive the abuse, which means normalizing it, minimizing it. This is what people who love you do. Love and abuse go hand in hand. Love and control go hand in hand. So that education needs to be there for child victims of domestic violence who sit around colouring in while their parents are screaming because they're so used to it. It's so normal. That education will also hopefully turn on that light switch around that not being normal. What you're going through is not normal. And as you said, talking to a trusted adult. Yeah. Okay, look, Brendan, I would love to talk to you more. I think I could, pick your brain all day and discuss this more. But obviously, we've got time constraints. So I just wanted to say thank you to you. I am so grateful for your work. I talk about the work of the police in my book, Fake Love, Understanding and Healing from Narcissistic Abuse, and that, you guys put your lives on the line every single day to help people out there. But history is history. There is a reason that there is a lack of trust out there. But you are the way forward, because you are a police officer, a detective who has been on both sides. So you will have empathy. So I'm really grateful for you talking to us today. And I really hope that other police detectives, politicians will listen to this in Australia and around the world, and we'll all be able to, put our heads together, because this is a global epidemic. It is not just in the US, it's not just in Australia or the UK. This is global. So we all need to come together and have like a global summit on what we can do to protect victims. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And I want to say thank you to you, because, we've talked about all the reasons for mistrust. We've talked about all the reasons for, sort of this systemic issue with the system, particularly with police. So thank you for giving me the platform to show that, by and large, police officers are doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time. Obviously, there's outliers, just like in every profession, but police officers, by and large, have good hearts. They want to do the right thing. Sometimes they just don't have all the information they need. And so thank you for giving me the ability to say that, and to, hopefully show your audience that going to law enforcement isn't going to be inherently a negative experience for them.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Brandon. Thank you for your time.
Of course, it was great to talk to you, Nova.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Fake Love and Flying Monkeys. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode, guys, as much as I enjoyed the discussion with myself and Detective Brandon Wootan. He certainly is a driving force in the United States around stamping out the global epidemic of domestic violence with his holistic and inspiring approach. And on that note, it's bye from me for now. Don't forget to subscribe to my other social media channels, and to get your copy of my best-selling book, Fake Love, Understanding and Healing from Narcissistic Abuse. And of course, if you'd like to have a one-on-one session with me, please just message me here, my web link below. And no matter where you are in the world, I would love to be able to support you. Until the next episode, guys, remember, you are worthy of love, and you are certainly worthy of a whole lot more than a lifetime of fake love and flying monkeys.